the Finding Fanon project is the second in a long line of works and projects that David and I have been working and building upon. Our practice spreads across almost 8 years now. Of course, we have our individual practices, but on a collaborative level, we're very interested in conversations that relate to the post-colonial, whilst also exploring the digital space, connections, intersections, or quite the opposite to that. The Fanon project happened following a performance-based work or project which we developed called Biters, which I believe was around 2014, and kind of culminated around 2015, 2016. At this point in time where we were creating multiple alternate identities and creating these rap-based performances where we stole beats and rhymes, restructured them and represented them, I guess kind of to have a conversation around appropriation, its relationship with the gallery space. We kind of in an uncomfortable way noticed how our project was being invited merely as the entertainment. And I think it's something obviously that happens with performance work anyway, when, a performance artist is invited simply just to, fill bottoms on seats or, bodies in spaces. But we just didn't find that our work was being taken so seriously. And so in a way, David and I, we kind of went back to the drawing board. We had conversations around, I guess, the inspirations behind our practice. David spoke a bit about his relationship with different types of thinkers and so on. And my grounding kind of came from Frantz Fanon's ideas, where I'd read his work, particularly Black Skin, White Masks in my younger years and during my BA. And his writings, they spoke to me in quite a profound sense. As a young Black man, having grown up both in London and in Essex and to have experienced racism in various ways, this piece of writing spoke to me like no other. It spoke to me about my experiences of having been unlawfully arrested due to my race, placed within a cell, and really the experience of the Black person as we know it, not simply just at that time that it was written 50 plus years ago, but within a contemporary Western society, and really, in a sense, this fight for survival. So already you have so many things kind of going on there. But in addition to that, I'd found out that Fanon had apparently written these kind of plays that existed merely in, I guess, manuscript form. This is following a conversation with Kodjo Eshran, who is one half of the Otolith Collective. Whenever we speak, we always talk about science fiction and we geek out quite a lot. And I was really taken away by this idea that Fanon had written these plays, or that they kind of, existed in a really basic kind of form. I guess simply because his writings already had a kind of poetic resonance to me personally. So to imagine what these plays might sound or breathe or even look like really kind of blew my mind away. And so, I took that to David and we began this conversation, and the journey of these films began to take place. David, I don't know if there's anything in particular that you kind of, enter from, but that's where I'm coming from with that.
Yeah, for us, the lost plays, as they were at that time, were almost became like a mythological subject, I guess, like a search for something that wasn't present in the writings. Like there's the Fanon offers a lot of analysis, but then and really pinpoints in a way the human condition in a really profound way. But maybe maybe an answer is not there, and perhaps that answer was within the fictions. That was the kind of the conceit. Could they be found within these fictions? And so to create a fiction of our searching for these fictions was sort of felt like a good meta starting point to this conversation, and a framing that made sense. And really the piece of writing that influenced probably the works the most is Frantz Fanon's own introduction to Black Skin, White Masks. Is that it has a tone, it has a kind of polemic, it has analysis, but then these kind of really visceral sections. It is like a work of poetry, but at the same time as being very precise, I think, and trying to carry that tone through into our writings as we started to kind of go back and forth with writings about our experiences, our kind of opposite sides of the colonial coin, as it were, which I'm sure we'll go into later. It seemed like a really good starting point. We did try to track down the plays. We found that they were in an archive in Caen. This was 2015, but we weren't allowed to see them because they were going to be published at some point. They didn't say when, but managed to track down some small excerpts that had been written up in a PhD where Fanon's brother, who had transcribed the plays for Fanon from memory, or anyway, I've probably got that story slightly wrong, but anyway, there was these fragments from that transcription that we were able to see, and yeah, it was interesting. It was very kind of a kind of quite sparse modernist sort of plays, which seemed really fascinating. But yeah, it didn't feel right to kind of just appropriate that text in any way. So the films became a response to that work and that thinking, really. Yeah, so that's the outline of where the Fanon project came from.
All right, so I'm sorry that probably I prevented you from reading those plays without being aware of it. It was a work of about 15 years to persuade the right owners, the family, and so on, that they were worth publishing. I had read them in 2000, I think, something like that. I had access to this archive, which is where most publishers deposit their archives. It's a sort of foundation, and they're fantastic with the job they've done. And slowly, a number of writers, mostly poets and artists, thinkers also, like Félix Guattari, decided to leave their archives to that place. And the Fanon family did that also, and that was quite complicated. His brother was still alive, and he was very proprietary about those plays. He showed them to me, but didn't want to. I mean, he just waved them to me, but didn't want to have me read them a couple of years before. So it took us a long time to persuade everybody that it was worth first publishing all the unpublished or forgotten or lost material of Fanon, which is largely his psychiatric work, which is really quite important, plus a number of political texts, but persuading them to publish also the plays, which they were not sure whether they were really work of a young man without much interest, etc., or not. Took a long time. For me, they were really extraordinary when I read them. Reading is not exactly the best way. They need to be performed. We've had a couple of performances in France and in English, and they take a life of their own. They're really quite extraordinary in terms of theatre. So it's as if suddenly a sort of dramatist had entered the history of drama of the 20th century 50 years later. We could just see that. Took a lot of time to decrypt them because the typescripts were very damaged. We're still missing one scene in one of the plays. But I think it was worth it. It was very moving every time they were performed. I think people were very stunned by the power. So you're right. There's a strong poetic thread in his writing throughout, even in his final book, The Wretched of the Earth, which is a political texts mostly, and about not just about decolonization, but about the pitfalls and the dangers. So it's a sort of warning that he left because he knew he was dying. He had a leukemia and had nothing to lose at that point. It was not really he was not writing from within a political movement anymore, respecting aspects and this and that. In spite of that, it's a very lyrical text, and it's astonishing. He didn't write, by the way; he dictated. So it has this sort of very bodily nature. I spent a lot of time with the woman who took those plays under dictation and took the two books under dictation. And he walked all the time when he dictated. Sometimes she wouldn't have the time to write down a sentence. He had forgotten about it, so he would make another one. It really came from inside. There's a very lyrical dimension in his work. So I think you were right in all that. I must say, when I think I saw the films about 4 years ago in Miami, something like that, and then I've watched them 2 or 3 more times. I thought these are much deeper than half of the criticism on Fanon that I've read. And I've read, in terms of understanding Fanon, and I've read quite a lot. It's often very superficial or naive, because you've stressed the crucial thing for him, I think, which is that he was fundamentally someone who was thinking about curing or dealing with alienation as an experience of trauma that needed somehow to be solved, and also being very worried about what could go wrong. There's no certainty about the sort of glorious future in Fanon, etc. It's really quite striking. So on the one hand, you have this very deep analysis of the condition that is the mental and physical. It's very physical, so effects of the history of colonialism and racism, etc. But on the other hand, there's a worry and a commitment in processes of detoxification, or as he says, or curing, both at a personal and political level, which you really, which come through the films, really. So I thought that was very nice. Also, I've seen there's been a number of works that have been produced about Fanon, but they are about Fanon, so they restage a certain episode or place. Some films are very beautiful, but they don't convey the experience that Fanon wanted to convey as much. So I thought this is, so I was very happy to take part in this conversation. It's very nice.
Well, hugely flattered. Thank you very much.
It's not easy to do that. I've always thought, a sort of poetic or artistic relationship to a philosophical text. And also in the case of Fanon, half of his work is scientific. He was a really significant psychiatrist, and not just somebody who was a psychiatrist as his job, daytime job, and then a revolutionary on the side. He himself published a number of really interesting, significant psychiatric texts which reformed the discipline. And so it's difficult to really have a sort of artistic relationship to a text which is so complex and so full of layers. You can find influences of the great poet for Fanon at the time was Aimé Césaire, the great poet from Martinique. So there are inflections of Césaire. Césaire had written a poem which then he turned into a play called Et les chiens se taisaient, which clearly influenced to some degree Fanon. So you find that on the one hand. On the other hand, you find a very sharp, analytical, psychiatric analysis of modes of alienation. So conveying all that is quite an achievement, I thought.
Oh, thank you. It's very much appreciated, and I guess kind of thinking in retrospect to the moment of kind of like creation. But again, like I said, even personally to myself and my own like individual studio practice, the words, the writings, the sentiments in that came from Fanon really spoke to me in such a big way. At this point in time, I would have also been reading the likes of Assata Shakur's autobiography, who was, of course, a part of the Black Panther Party, Huey P. Newton's revolutionary suicide, so many other, books which spoke of struggle and revolution in as real a sense as possible, not this kind of idea of, at the end of this tunnel everyone's going to be happy and smiling, there'll be a celebration, but that in order for revolution to take place, there has to be sacrifice, and I think the biggest challenge to David and myself in making the work was really about being frank with one another as to our own lived experiences. As we tend to place ourselves within our bodies of work, both individually and collaboratively, we try to have conversations that some might find difficult, and especially in such an early point in time of our collaboration, to talk about the realities of racism and various class differences from our own experiences, and then that familial heritage. Of course, there was a lot of research involved, but there was so much kind of back and forth of talking, at times debating, at times not necessarily even agreeing with one another. And mind you, this point in time where we were having these conversations and also developing the scripts, which would turn into monologues for the films, the Brexit vote was kind of underway and also happened as well, and that really also had a profound effect, I think, on our, I guess, the direction, really, because if I remember correctly, David, like we both had different opinions as to what would happen. I think based on my experience of the different places I've grown up in the UK, I just knew that the UK would vote leave. As much as I would love there to be so many more places in the UK that are pretty much like London in terms of the range of cultures and backgrounds that people are from. London is such a small space, and so that understanding around histories or versions of histories that have been told, handed down, and so on, that was what I thought. And I believe, David, you felt that it was a no-brainer. The UK would vote to stay. But yeah,
well, I think what it was is that Brexit is a battle between like the super mega wealthy that created Brexit and the kind of the corporate elites that would have kept us in the EU. I thought the corporate elite still had a handle on politics in our country, but actually it already moved over to the mega rich, and that I didn't quite understand. But yeah, that's obvious now. But these sorts of analyses were what we were going into the work. But I think what grounds the work is that we, rather than kind of treating Fanon as a sacred philosophical theoretical text that we were kind of paying homage to, it was that we based it inside our own bodies, in a way, in the way that Fanon based his theory on his own body and his experience of the body in the world. And so I think that's what gave it its immediacy, and perhaps, it enabled it to, I don't know, transcend, I guess, that feeling of it being an essay about an essay or something. Yeah. It was, it was a work in its own right.
Yeah, it struck me a lot. The Fanon, what interested me in working on Fanon is that it was not just theoretical. The text is always written in two persons, even he says in three persons. The first person, which is his own experience, or the embodiment of his own experience as he can imagine that others are sharing it. And then the analysis of that experience. So you said the lived experience is I don't know what translation you use to read Black Skin, White Mask, but the first one is very beautiful, except that there are a number of mistakes. And the chapter on the lived experience of the black man was translated as the fact of blackness, which says the opposite, because it's not so much a fact as an experience which is constructed, etc. So the new edition and the new translation has that. But you're right, he's constantly going from lived experience, which he describes as a bodily experience, to the analysis of the systems, the political systems, the historical systems, the conflicts, historical and present. And so the analysis of that, and of the effect that this has on this lived experience, it's largely a description of that, the first book, Black Skin, White Masks. And to the point that he says that what was then called the corporal schema or body schema, which is the sort of the way the human body projects itself upon its environment neurologically, but then he interpreted that in a more cultural way. So the fact that when you walk in the street, you don't think that you're going to contract your hamstrings and your quadriceps in order to make a step in that direction or another. All this is integrated with the consciousness of the environment. What he says is that the first experience of the racist gaze destroys or damages the body schema, that there's a sort of a second layer under or above the body schema, which is the sort of epidermic, he calls that the epidermic racial layer, which then the person who's the object of this racist gaze experiences all the time, to the point that he had a good sense of humor also, Fanon. He says, when I'm in the train, I don't see myself in the first person or in the third person, but in a triple person, because there are always two seats, two empty seats around me. So this sort of relationship between the political systems of oppression, which can be either direct and violent, as in the colonial context, or can be sort of subtle. They can go through the gaze of a child who says, look, a black man, or whatever. You remember in this chapter? Yep. This relationship between those systems and the physical experience of the subject, and the alienation which is produced, where he or she experiences his or her own body as a thing instead of being a subject and moving through the world. I thought you really, that came through really well in the film, but to the point, but I don't know, that's for you to tell me, to the point that I thought that ultimately you were thinking that those bodies will not just be an algorithms and will just be produced by the dominant systems. And the way I saw it is that you started from a shipwreck, then you experience of the past, probably, with all the great hopes, Sankara, Lumumba, etc. And then you experience this sort of dematerialization, where the body is just an element in a formal system. And in the third film, there's a sort of future with the kids in nature, somehow going back to that in spite of the desertification and the ecological disaster which is produced by this whole machinery. But by then you're sort of disincarnated, you've turned into avatars or representation. So that's the way I saw it. I was just wondering whether you had, that was a whole calculation on your part, or whether it just came like that.
No, I think it's a really good question. To be honest, I think when we in the inception of the first film, the first project, or part of it, I don't think we really envisaged there being a collection of films or trilogy or what have you. there were conversations we wanted to approach in the first film in a way of kind of where, yes, you know, our physical bodies are beginning to kind of be absorbed by these digital frameworks or algorithms and so on, kind of plugging into history as we know it, or have been taught, and that response on those various layers of our own, you know, experiences, interconnected, and ones that perhaps again pit us in different social and political kind of parts of the coin, as it were. I think it's by the time we came towards the, you know, kind of like the end of the first film, we knew that there was so much more that we wanted to discuss, and also even taking on I guess the methods that we'd use to create the films in terms of script writing, in terms of the development of sound and soundtracking, to potentially work with other communities as well, which we did do with the Gaiden or side story element of the Fanon series. We just knew coming toward the end, it would just feel a bit too. It would feel like we hadn't done perhaps, you know, justice to such an important conversation, as it were, to really leave off in that way. But there was, you know, I don't know, David, maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think there was necessarily a plan per se to, you know, to develop a range of films. It was really when we were coming to that editing kind of constructing point that we saw that there was much more space to expand on the conversation.
Yeah, I think both our solo practices revolve around the virtual in many ways, and I think by omitting that from the first film, we knew that it was a space that we wanted to encounter and have a conversation about. I don't think it's necessarily about the dissolution of the body completely into the virtual. It's just that it becomes another aspect. You know, I think, you know, if Fanon is seeing the body almost in the third person, like you're kind of almost watching yourself and you're seeing yourself through the other's gaze, that's, you know, that is pretty much the virtual experience. Yeah. That you're inside, you know, you activate an avatar, and the avatar may look nothing like you, but somehow your position in society, your race, your identity seeps through into that in a way which is difficult to, I don't know, to erase, I think. And I think that's what we were thinking about in the second and the third films, in, you know, the way that the virtual is often seen as a possible liberatory space, that it becomes like, yeah, this equal plane, the space where suddenly everyone is free and everyone's the same, and it's just not. it's still, you know, a lot of the structures still exist, the hierarchy still exists, the racism still exists, not only in interactions but also in the very way that these spaces are coded, like the character choices, etc. Yeah, the kind of the structures of corporate late capitalist life are kind of built into these systems that you encounter the virtual in. So yeah, it's very complex. When you were talking about Fanon, it was making me think again about Lacan a little bit, like just because I really came into Fanon through looking at psychoanalysis, because that's kind of part of my history, is looking at Freud, looking at Lacan, etc. And, you know, thinking about his ideas of, you know, I see the can and the can sees me. It's sort of that idea of wordplay, the idea of the self, the body. You know, I think in many ways Fanon takes those concepts and takes them that next step and kind of really thinks about the social body, the racialized body, and which Lacan really doesn't talk about at all. It's, you know, it's very abstracted. It's not really about social class so much, etc. But anyway, yeah, it's a kind of it just opened up so much for us, just having that starting point and then kind of being able to push through into these different areas. And you're right in recognizing that, you know, once we made the first film, we were really thinking about history, because we were thinking about my grandfather being teaching pineapple growing in Kenya, talking about Larry's uncle being caught up in detention centers in the UK, and how those were two sides of the colonial coin in a way. And the legacies that are then kind of, you know, recently there's been this idea of epigenetics, that stress is passed down through the blood, through genetics, and that these are all somehow linked in many ways. And then once we had talked about the past, and then we wanted to make this one in the virtual space, which felt very much, yes, the present, then really the third film had to be made. We had to think about the future, and that's where the children came in. So yeah, it's quite a natural arc, really.
Let me switch on the lights for a second.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, you know, the interesting thing though, I guess, was also with the last film, we spoke a bit about whether or not the children should exist within that, right? Because I think it was it was me and Claire Barrett, your wife, David, who, you know, we strongly felt that where the multiple layers of conversations were going, it had to embrace the future, and in order to do that, you bring in the youth. You know, us ourselves, or we're getting on. So, you know, we have children ourselves. So why do they become excluded from the conversation? You know, their experience of various aspects of prejudice starts from very young, right? So so it was good that that Claire and I won that argument with you.
Well, I was just anxious about, you know, depictions of people and consent and all that stuff. But anyway, yeah, I think in the end you're right. But it's, yeah, you know, lots of different kind of psychological things go into making an artwork. So it's but it's, yeah, it was important that they were in that film together.
Yeah, I thought that worked very well. Yeah, what you said about the virtual. So Fanon himself says that he finds under his skin historicity. So the accumulation of all the stereotypes and so on. But he sees that in the gaze of the other, but he finds it in his own skin, under his own skin. And that is this sort of objectifying, or he says a reifying process of the racist gaze, and more generally of colonialism in general, which turns the other into a thing, the culture of the other into a solidified object in a museum and so on. You're right about Lacan. In fact, he wrote one of the texts that I published is his own PhD in medicine, which for a long time had been really neglected because people thought that he had been refused. Black Skin, White Mask had been his initial work for his PhD in psychiatry. This had been refused. And therefore he improvised very quickly a PhD in sort of very neurological psychiatry. I was never really convinced about that, because Fanon wrote very quickly everything anyway, first. Secondly, he says that because Black Skin, White Mask had a historical sociological component, it could not just be a PhD. And he wrote a PhD, and in his PhD, what he demonstrates is the fact that a neurological trouble does not determine a psychiatric illness directly. It may be the cause of it or the origin of it, but that there are a number of layers that come in between that give the disease its particular form. In this case, he was looking at a thing called Friedreich ataxia, which is a neurological degenerescence where people slowly lose the ability to walk, and then sometimes develop some delusions of possession, some religious delirium and so on, but not always. And so he analyzes that at length and shows that it's not just the organic, which is the cause of the disease, but it's also the personal history, the ontogenesis, the psychoanalytical history of the individual that gives the form. And he says you need to add to that sociogenesis, so the role of society. And that's where he puts his chapter on Lacan, because at that time, 1948, 49, he saw in Lacan, in fact, someone who sort of extracted psychoanalysis from a purely individual bourgeois family environment and brought into it sociological considerations. And it's true that during the war, Lacan had written a number of texts from that perspective. And Lacan was quite interested in this view. So the idea that the self-recognition, so that goes through the famous mirror stage when the child builds a recognition of his face or projects a recognition of his face or her face onto the material skull that he sees in the mirror. That impressed Fanon a lot, and he thought that was determined also socially, as Lacan notes, by the mothers using language, etc. But he thought that one of the effects of the experience of the racist gaze was the dissolution of the image of the self. And in that, he was using concepts that were quite popular in French psychiatry at the time. He followed the lectures of Merleau-Ponty, the philosopher, who was working with psychiatrists who worked on pathologies of the image of the body. So that was really part of his thought. But what he wanted to add to that was the social dimension to this pathology. And he wrote texts in Algeria about that also. So it was not just. It was, in general, the experience of the racist gaze. But of course, Black Skin, White Mask is about the experience of the black man who is the object of this gaze. So no, I think you're right. It's all about the exploration of those layers of representation that somehow get woven into the experience of the individual through their relationships with others, within this colonial system or within this racist environment, which is ingrained in the gaze of everybody, and how to try to disentangle that and to produce, because that's the other thing when you mention the idea of identity. That Fanon is always also very suspicious about the idea that you need to find a substitutive identity, like either because you find yourself more white than the others, as in Martinique. I don't know whether you've been to the Caribbean, but it's like seems to be a sport there. And he's very dismissive of that. That's why the book is called Black Skin, White Masks. It's about people who think who put on a white mask. But he's also equally suspicious of negritude, which was the negritude or negritude, which was the sort of philosophy that was developed by Césaire and then by Senghor, which was a celebration of black values and the idea that somehow all black people in the world carried in themselves those African values, which were values of a non-instrumental relationship to the world, a non-exploitative relationship to the world. That was a great part of Césaire's great poem, the Notebook of a Return to the Native Land. He knew the poem by heart, Fanon. Fanon took part in the electoral campaigns of Césaire, who was running for the Communist Party after the Second World War in Martinique. So he was very involved with it. So he knew the poem by heart, etc. But if you read the Black Skin, White Mask carefully, you'll see that he parodies it a bit. And he finds that also another pathology. And that one refuge in an identity that's not going to solve the reality of the present. And that's largely developed in the conclusion, which is like a poem, the conclusion of Black Skin, White Mask, when he says he doesn't want to be the slave of an identity. And it's in the present that he has to construct his own self, etc., and somehow to deal with this historicity. So it's a complex picture where somehow the body is determined by systems of representation which have developed historically, basically. Mm. And that's what he wants to analyze. And that's why that's why it's not, as you said, I think, or it appears at some point in the film where it says, it's not just about exploitation. It's not even just about violence, physical violence. It's sort of interiorization. So that's his main line of argument. And when he looks at anti-colonial struggle in Wretched of the Earth, which speaks also about the Algerian struggle, what he says is that the fight detoxifies from the dependency complex or inferiority complex, but he sees that he distinguishes countries where decolonization has been granted by the colonizer from countries where people had to fight, like Vietnam, and then of course Algeria, which was a long struggle. In the second place, he says even if the people have not been involved in violence directly, because they have taken part in the organization of the struggle in order to counter this extraordinary violence that they have been submitted to, somehow they've become immune to the fascination for leaders, for superior politicians. And he sees in that the possibility of a different decolonization from what he was witnessing already at the time, where it was in fact a form of neo-colonialism which was instituting itself. So he's really interested in the way physical attitudes, manners of being, self-reflections could be transformed by a struggle that he sees as revolutionary. For him, the nationalist struggle was essentially a revolutionary struggle, of which the purpose was not just to build a nation, but to create, in fact, a new humanity, he says. I don't know, you could say he was very naive, etc. I don't think he was not naive in the end, but the whole body of work, which lasts only 10 years, because he died age 36, which is astonishing when you see how many pages is written and how much stuff is done, and traveling, etc. He was in the Second World War, so he joined in the Free French Forces when he was 18, or a bit early 19. So during all that period, and that was difficult coming from Martinique, it's not easy. So the whole body of work is a very strong analysis of this sort of determination of the self by all these historical oppressions, and also an attempt at understanding what could be a disalienation, or how a disalienation might work. He starts very optimistic in his first book. We found when he submitted his PhD proposal, he had a sort of justification for it, etc. And his point was to sort of solve the problems that could split the human communities. So he started, and that was his purpose. The examiners saw that, in fact, they were quite shrewd in their reports. It might have the opposite effect. But by the end, he thinks much more in terms of a historical struggle. But this historical struggle, seen from the point of view of the psychiatrist. He says in his PhD that at some stage he would want to write a book on history as the working out of complexes, inferiority, superiority, etc. The desire for identification. That's why it's not by chance that Brexit came into your thought, because if there's one pathology of identification, which is a big topic for psychiatrists, it's a great example of that. When you ask people, but what is this identity in the end that you are, which you're finding the sovereignty again?
Absolutely.
Okay, so no, I thought it's what you've done reflected well this complexity precisely.
Thank you. Yeah, it's
Yeah, I was also surprised by the fact that you were looking for those plays, because I spent quite a lot of time looking for those plays. That was a good idea.
Yeah, no, we actually looked at the potential of, you know, getting funding to travel to like various places,
Yeah.
to try to find some of that material. It was quite incredible actually, because we were determined and prepared to do that. Obviously that was dealt a death, but it was to work in this kind of, I guess, investigative manner, but then to try to retain the artistic kind of like resonance, which again, and I think Jean, you know, you've also pointed out that Fanon is quite poetic in the way that he speak. Um, was very important. Is very important to keep all of the balances of these ideas. So whilst in a way it was a shame that we didn't get to do that, it was, I guess, it was quite incredible as to how some of these other strands and approaches, I guess, you know, transpired, and I guess trying to rely upon the words that we knew, the words that I personally knew already, that Fanon had written, how that might then make its way into, you know, this context of trying to find Fanon, you know.
Yeah, it shows how much his writing is efficient. I mean, a lot of people have said it's a bit poetic, it's a bit abstract, because also he didn't have time, so he rushed through things. But somehow it works. I mean, the audience of Fanon's work is absolutely stunning. So there, that brings me to this question. You said initially you were disappointed by the way people were looking at your early work as sort of decorative in a way. So how do you see your impact, or how do you organize the material to produce an impact or to have an effect on the visitor or spectator? I was curious to see that, because it seemed to me it seems to work. And when I saw it first in Miami, there was something like 200 people, I would think, and they were quite fascinated. We had lunch afterwards, etc. So it worked. But so how do you see that, and what is your aim?
Well, I guess obviously we were kind of, I was specifically talking about a project that we developed prior to Finding Fanon, Biters, which I guess, you know, visually, audibly, and so on, it presented itself differently by, I guess, harnessing popular culture, elements of popular culture, including hip hop, including video games, comics, and other aspects of mass culture. It kind of, it was then kind of like read by, I guess, institutions in a way that there was simply just fun to be had, or there wasn't really I guess any layers of critique within that. I think with, you know, so then kind of moving into the Finding Fanon project, I feel like we still retained the desire to explore and utilize these aspects of popular culture. They just, I guess, they just resonate in a different way. You know, even the way that the soundtrack was developed is something that I spent a lot of time kind of composing and thinking about the way that the resonances of the words may overlap and even loop with the arrangements as well. So it wasn't really a thing of, you know, let's make work that perhaps is talking more seriously, but really let's be even more direct, I guess, with the conversation that we're having. Because with Biters, I guess where David and I, we really essentially we were in our performance, we were kind of a hip hop crew of sorts. I feel like because there's definitely a satirical kind of element to it. It kind of flew over people's heads, maybe, and so it kind of, you know, there are things, I guess, for us that we felt worked, but then other things that, yeah, in terms of that reception of the work simply as entertainment and people just thinking, oh yeah, you know, those really cool beats, or the way that you brought, I don't know, and kind of mixed up Nas with the likes of the Wu-Tang Clan sounds. It, you know, I guess it's almost in the interesting thing about that, when I think about that, and the question you posed, Jean, is it makes me think, I guess, about the way in which Black culture across you know the decades has simply been absorbed as entertainment. You know, if we look at the likes of Nina Simone, for example,
Yeah.
a lot of white folks simply just love to listen to the groove, or you know, Bob Marley and so on. It's simply just the groove and not the words, not the actual sentiment from which it's coming behind. And that, I think, is something that, yeah, in coming back to our practice and the beginnings of Finding Fanon, we were aware needed to be, I guess, yeah, confronted, really.
Yeah, in a way, I think it was taking it, stripping our ideas back in some way. I mean, a lot of the visual kind of cues, I guess, for Finding Fanon 1 was kind of, I mean, yeah, Claire Barrett was cinematographer on several of my earlier films, and I think she brought this thing of yeah, observing the body in space in a way, which in a kind of quite a clean way in a way, but also observing, yeah, very much the body. So it's skin, it's eyes, it's sort of it's these contrasts, and then these conversations like us playing a wire, or this kind of the tenderness of putting a wire on a face and stuff, like these sort of these little moments.
Nice part of the film, yeah.
That just you know, that then continued into Fanon 3. I think, you know, taking it away from, I mean, yeah, pop cultural ideas around the pop cultural are integral to both Larry and I's work, like as solo practices. And I think, you know, for us to take that into Biters, it makes perfect sense. But I think it needed kind of this grounding in almost like a, it's like we were going too fast, too far with that for people, and they needed that grounding of like, now this is Fanon, and this is, you know, this is what we're talking about. And that's what Finding Fanon is. It's like, it's almost like a declaration of, although it's very poetic, it's very kind of subtle, it's aesthetically beautiful, but it's also, it's a manifesto, I think, of sorts. It's sort of saying, this is where we are. How do we go from here into the future? Like, and it's, as we say, it's, you know, it's an unfinished conversation, as Stuart Hall would say. It's like, it's starting something very direct. It's starting something that actually addresses these things rather than brushing them under the carpet, which is what leads to things like Brexit. It's where no one's really talking about it, and yet Meghan Markle has to move to the other side of the world because she's Black. It's like, it's all these things are interconnected, and yeah, it has to be talked about in an open manner. I mean, we exhibit in white cubes, and they're so white, you know, so it's how to kind of break that up from inside, and to do that you have to make work that fits in that space. And Fanon, the Finding Fanon, does that in a way that Biters is more of a confrontational, it's more of a provocation in a way. And I think, and so the kind of subtleties of that work is sort of missed by people who don't have that grounding.
Okay, well, I think that answers most of my questions. It's really great to talk to you.
Yeah, it's been great talking to you, Jean.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
And thanks for the work.
No problem.